Let me tell you something that nobody wants to hear, and I found over the years that the things nobody wants to hear are precisely the things everybody needs to listen to the most carefully. So I'm going to ask you to set aside for a few minutes whatever it is you thought you came here to receive, and I want you to receive instead what I'm about to give you, because what I'm about to give you isn't comfortable. It isn't flattering, but it is the truth, and the truth, properly received, has the extraordinary capacity to alter the entire direction of a human life. You are training for a smaller life. Not consciously, not with intention, not with malice toward yourself, but with every choice, with every habit, with every morning you let slide into afternoon without purpose, with every evening you trade for distraction, with every dream you postpone to a tomorrow that you quietly suspect will never arrive. You are in the gym of diminishment. You are doing the repetitions of reduction. You are building the muscles of mediocrity. And the terrible tragedy of it is that you've gotten very, very good at it. Now, before you decide I'm being harsh, let me ask you something. Let me ask you the kind of question that a good mentor asks, not the kind that makes you feel better about where you are, but the kind that shows you clearly where you're headed. And the question is this: 5 years from now, if you continue doing exactly what you're doing right now, if you continue thinking exactly what you're thinking right now, if you continue spending your time precisely the way you're spending it today, what will your life look like? Where will you be? Who will you have become? I've been asking that question to audiences for decades. And do you know what I've discovered? Most people, when they sit honestly with that question, don't like the picture it paints. They see more of the same. They see stagnation dressed up in different clothes. They see the same worries wearing a new face, the same frustrations with a new address, the same distance between who they are and who they always imagined they would become. And here's what I want you to understand about that vision, yet that uncomfortable, unsettling picture of 5 years from now if nothing changes. That isn't fate, that is a forecast. And a forecast, unlike fate, can be altered, but only if you're willing to first admit that the forecast exists. The reason most people are training for a smaller life isn't because they lack talent. I've met extraordinarily talented people living extraordinarily small existences. Talent without direction is simply potential that never found its assignment. The reason most people are training for a smaller life isn't because opportunity has abandoned them. In all of human history, there has never been a time of greater opportunity, greater access, greater possibility than right now, today, in this age. The reason is far more personal than talent and far more sobering than circumstance. The reason most people are training for a smaller life is because they've made a series of small, seemingly insignificant decisions over time that have collectively constructed a container just large enough to hold them, but far too small to hold everything they were designed to become. Let me talk about how this happens, because understanding the mechanism of diminishment is the first step toward reversing it. It begins with comfort. Now understand, I am not against comfort. I want you to be comfortable. I want your life to have ease and pleasure and rest and enjoyment. Those are not enemies of greatness. But there is a version of comfort that is a counterfeit. There is a version of comfort that presents itself as satisfaction, but is actually sedation. There is a kind of comfort that doesn't say I have arrived, but instead says I have stopped. And the difference between those two statements is everything. When a young person finishes school and steps into the world, there is usually a period of discomfort. Things are hard, resources are limited. The gap between where they are and where they want to be is wide and visible and sometimes terrifying. And that gap, that discomfort, that tension between current reality and desired future, that is fuel. That is the engine. That is precisely the condition under which human beings do their greatest growing, their deepest learning, their most significant becoming. The problem is that most people, as soon as life becomes tolerable, make a quiet agreement with tolerable. They negotiate a truce with mediocrity. They find a level of existence that isn't painful enough to demand change and isn't fulfilling enough to constitute a life fully lived, and they settle there. They unpack their bags in the land of just enough and start calling it home. And once you call it home, something happens to your appetite. Once you agree to just enough, your hunger begins to diminish. Not all at once. This isn't a dramatic event. This is a slow erosion. Like a river that loses its current and gradually fills with silt, your ambition begins to quiet. Your dreams, which were once vivid and specific and urgent, become vague and distant, like photographs fading on a wall. You still know they're there, but you've stopped looking at them clearly. You still tell yourself you want them, but you've stopped arranging your life in service of having them. And this is the beginning of training for a smaller life. Now let me be specific, because specificity is where change lives. Generalities make people nod, but specifics make people move. So let me show you exactly what this training looks like, because I want you to recognize it not as some abstract concept, but as something you may have encountered in your own daily experience. The first exercise in the training for a smaller life is the postponement of decision. Every day you are presented with choices that matter. Not dramatic choices necessarily, not choices between good and evil, not choices that announce their significance with trumpets and banners, but quiet, ordinary choices that are accumulating a verdict on your character and your future. The choice to read something that elevates your mind or to consume something that merely fills your time. The choice to begin a project you've been carrying in your imagination or to delay it one more day. The choice to have the difficult conversation that needs to happen or to avoid it for another week. The choice to pursue health or to excuse its absence. These choices seem small in the moment. They seem individually inconsequential. But here's what I've learned about small choices. They are not small. There is no such thing as an insignificant decision when decisions are compounding. Every choice you make is a vote for who you're becoming. Every postponement is a vote for the smaller version of yourself. I once heard someone say they were waiting for the right time to begin. They were waiting until the children were older, until the business settled down, until the economy improved, until they felt more ready, until the circumstances aligned more favorably. And I wanted to ask them, and sometimes I did ask, what makes you think the future will be more generous to the unprepared than the present? What evidence do you have that circumstances will eventually conspire to give you an easy entrance into a difficult undertaking? Because in my experience, the circumstances don't improve until the person does. The conditions outside rarely organize themselves in your favor until the conditions inside have first been organized. You don't wait for the right time to begin. You begin, and in the beginning, you create a time that is right. The second exercise in the training for a smaller life is the rehearsal of limitation. And this one is subtle, so pay close attention. Every day in the privacy of your own mind, you are either rehearsing possibility or rehearsing limitation. You are either practicing the mental posture of someone who expects to find a way or practicing the mental posture of someone who expects to be stopped. And what you rehearse daily in your mind, you will eventually perform confidently in your life. I've watched people walk into a room full of opportunity and see only obstacles. Not because the obstacles were dominant, they weren't, but because obstacle recognition had become their primary mental skill. They'd practiced it for so long, refined it through so many repetitions, that it had become automatic, involuntary, nearly impossible to switch off. They could find the reason something wouldn't work faster than they could find the reason it might. They could produce a list of why not in the time it took others to produce the beginning of a plan. And they called this realism. They called it being practical. They called it not setting yourself up for disappointment. But what it actually was, and I say this with tremendous compassion, what it actually was expertise in smallness. They had become world-class at staying exactly where they were. Now, I want to talk about the people in your life because this is a dimension of the training for a smaller life that is rarely discussed with the directness it deserves. The people you spend the majority of your time with are not neutral forces. They are either expanding your sense of what's possible or they are contracting it. They are either calling you up towards something larger or they are pulling you down towards something more comfortable. And often the people who pull you down are not enemies. They are friends. They are family. They are people who genuinely care about you but who have themselves made the agreement with just enough and who find, whether consciously or not, that your pursuit of something more is an uncomfortable mirror. When you decide to grow, you will find that some people in your life will celebrate it. These are the people you treasure, but you will also find, and you must be prepared for this, that some people will resist it. Not openly, not with declared opposition, but with subtle discouragement, with the well-meaning comment that plants doubt, with the cautionary tale that arrives whenever you share a bold plan, with the very specific kind of support that helps you feel better about not trying rather than the kind that helps you find the courage to try. And you must understand that the people who do this are not malicious. They are simply operating from within the same container they've agreed to inhabit, and your attempt to escape it reminds them that escape is possible, which means their choice not to escape is exactly that, a choice. And that recognition is threatening to someone who has told themselves they have no choice. Examine your 5 closest associations. Not your acquaintances, not the people you see occasionally, your 5 closest, most consistent, most influential associations. Ask yourself honestly, are these people living at the level you aspire to reach? Are they growing, learning, striving, building, becoming? Are there conversations about ideas and vision and possibility? Or are there conversations predominantly about grievances, about the failures of others, about why the world is unfair, about why their circumstances prevent progress? I am not asking you to abandon people you love, but I am asking you to be honest about the influence those associations are having on the trajectory of your life. Because association is not passive. It is one of the most powerful forces in the shaping of a human destiny. Aristotle understood this. Long before modern psychology gave us the language of social influence and behavioral contagion, Aristotle knew that to be the philosopher you aspired to be, you had to dwell among philosophers. Not to be elitist, not to look down on others, but because ideas are contagious, habits are contagious, attitudes are contagious, and the particular brand of limitation that keeps people small is among the most contagious conditions I have ever observed. Let me shift now and talk about something that is at the absolute center of this conversation, and that is the subject of what you feed your mind. Because here is a principle I want you to write down, carry with you, and review regularly. You will become what you consistently consume, not instantly, not dramatically, but inevitably, inexorably, with the same certainty that the seed becomes the tree that matches its nature. You will become what you consistently consume. Now, most people, if you ask them what they've been reading this year, will struggle to give you a full answer. Most people, if you ask them what they've been learning, what new ideas they've been wrestling with, what books have challenged their thinking or expanded their understanding, will have very little to show you. Not because they're incapable, they are fully capable, but because somewhere along the way, they stopped investing in their own intellectual and philosophical development and started simply reacting to whatever the day brought them. They stopped being students. And when you stop being a student, when you stop deliberately pursuing the kind of knowledge that transforms the quality of your thinking, you don't stay the same. You begin to contract. The mind, like the muscle, either grows or atrophies. There is no holding pattern. Think about what the average person is feeding their mind. Hour after hour of content designed not to elevate, not to challenge, not to expand the aperture of possibility, but to entertain, to distract, to fill the space where boredom and discomfort might otherwise prompt reflection. And I want to be careful here because I'm not against entertainment. Rest is legitimate. Pleasure is legitimate. Enjoyment is legitimate. But there is a proportion problem. There is a ratio issue. When the vast majority of your mental consumption is passive, reflexive, designed by others to keep your attention without requiring your growth, you are training for a smaller life. You are feeding the diminished version of yourself and starving the version that was capable of so much more. I read every day. I have read every day for as long as I can remember. Not because I was born with an exceptional love of reading. I wasn't actually, but because a mentor early in my life showed me clearly that the people who read and the people who don't are not operating in the same world, even when they're standing in the same room. The person who reads broadly, who thinks deeply, who wrestles consistently with ideas that challenge and expand their perspective, that person has access to a dimension of possibility that the non-reader simply cannot perceive. It's not arrogance to say that. It's observation. And the remedy is so extraordinarily simple, so extraordinarily accessible, so disproportionately powerful relative to its cost. 30 minutes a day, a good book, consistent application, that it astonishes me how few people avail themselves of it. Read about the people who have built something magnificent. Read about the principles that underlie extraordinary achievement. Read about philosophy, about history, about the nature of human potential and the conditions that release it. Read things that make you uncomfortable. Read things that challenge your current beliefs. Read things that show you a version of possible that you hadn't previously considered. And then sit with what you've read. Think about it. Apply it. Let it do what good ideas do when they're allowed to take root in a prepared mind. Let it rearrange your interior landscape. Because here's the thing about a life well-read and a mind well-fed. It makes you structurally incapable of accepting a small life without knowing what you're doing. Ignorance of possibility is a kind of comfort. When you genuinely don't know what's achievable, the gap between what you have and what's possible doesn't hurt. But once you've been shown, once you've seen clearly what human beings are capable of, what discipline and vision and philosophy and consistent action can produce, you can no longer shrink without knowing that you're shrinking. And that awareness is both uncomfortable and liberating because it means the next step is entirely yours to take. Now, I want to address something about goals because the training for a smaller life has a very specific relationship with the subject of goals, and it's a relationship that most people have never examined. Most people have a complicated, half-committed, intellectually reserved relationship with their own goals. They have wishes, they have preferences, they have things they think would be nice. They have the idea of goals without the architecture of goals. And there is an enormous difference between wishing for something and building a life in service of achieving it. A wish says, I would like this if it happens to come my way, if circumstances arrange themselves favorably, if I get lucky, if the universe decides to be generous in my direction. A goal says, this is what I have committed to producing with my effort, my time, my discipline, and my daily decisions. A wish is passive. A goal is active. A wish lives in the imagination. A goal lives in the calendar, in the morning routine, in the daily checklist, in the structure of how you spend the hours that make up your days. And here is what I've observed about people who are training for a smaller life. They tend to keep their goals vague, deliberately vague sometimes, because vagueness provides insulation. A vague goal cannot be clearly failed. If you say, I want to be more successful, you can always find some interpretation of your current circumstances that satisfies that definition. But if you say, I intend to produce this specific result by this specific date through these specific actions, now you've created a clear standard. Now the gap between where you are and where you've committed to be is visible and measurable. And visible, measurable gaps create pressure. And pressure for people who have been training for a smaller life is deeply uncomfortable. So they keep the goals foggy. They talk about wanting things without deciding to have them. They say someday, when what they mean is, I'm afraid to commit. They say, when the time is right, when what they mean is, I don't want to face the possibility of genuine failure. And I understand that. Failure is painful. The distance between a clearly stated goal and your inability to reach it is one of the more uncomfortable experiences available to a human being. But here is what I want you to consider. The pain of a failed attempt is finite and educational. The pain of a life spent in the avoidance of attempt is lifelong and accumulating. Which would you rather carry? The temporary discomfort of trying and not succeeding? Learning from it, adjusting, trying again with greater wisdom, or the permanent weight of who you might have become if only you'd had the courage to genuinely try. Let me talk about mornings. I know that seems like an abrupt turn, but stay with me, because this is where the training for a smaller life happens in real time, in the most specific and concrete way possible. How you begin your day is not a trivial matter. How you begin your day is the opening argument in the case you're making for your own life. It sets the tone, establishes the orientation, declares the intention, or fails to. And for most people, the morning is surrendered before it's even begun. The alarm sounds, and immediately the phone is in hand. Immediately the mind, which was just in the extraordinary state of morning freshness, that clean, uncluttered, highly receptive state that exists in the first moments of consciousness, is flooded with the noise of the world, with other people's agendas, with the news which is almost uniformly designed to produce anxiety rather than possibility, with social media which is a catalog of other people's curated performances. And this mind, which had the potential to spend its most creative, most receptive hour in reflection, in planning, in the deliberate orientation toward the day's most important purposes, this mind is instead handed over to randomness and reaction. And then we wonder why we feel like the day is running us rather than us running the day. I am convinced that one of the most powerful practices available to a human being is the deliberate cultivation of a morning. Not elaborate necessarily, not requiring hours of ritual, but intentional, purposeful, shaped by the question, what do I want to bring to this day, rather than simply, what will this day bring to me? There is a posture of agency, and there is a posture of victimhood, and the morning is where you choose between them. Every single day you choose between them. And the choosing is not dramatic. It happens in ordinary moments, in quiet decisions, in the seemingly small act of how you spend the first hour of your waking life. Read something that grows you. Reflect on what matters. Review your goals, not as a chore, but as a compass check. Spend a few minutes in the kind of quiet that allows your own thoughts to surface rather than being perpetually drowned out by the thoughts of others. Move your body. Nourish your body deliberately rather than reflexively. Do these things and you are training for a larger life. Surrender the morning to distraction and reaction and you are doing the opposite. And here is the principle that underlies all of this. Discipline is not punishment. I want to say that again because it is one of the most misunderstood ideas in the conversation about human achievement. Discipline is not punishment. Discipline is not the grim, joyless self-denial of the things that make life pleasurable. Discipline is simply the practice of doing what serves your future self even when your present self would prefer to do something easier. That's all it is. It is choosing the investment over the indulgence consistently enough and long enough that the investment compounds into something magnificent. Every great life I have ever studied, every remarkable human achievement I have ever examined traces its roots to this one practice, the willingness to consistently do the things that need doing, whether or not the feeling of motivation is present. Because motivation is a weather phenomenon. It comes and goes. It is strong some days and absent on others. If you wait for motivation before you act, you will spend the majority of your life waiting. But discipline is a structure that doesn't depend on the weather. Discipline shows up in the rain. Discipline functions on the days when nothing feels exciting, when the goal seems distant, when the progress seems imperceptible. Discipline is what separates the person who merely dreams of a larger life from the person who actually builds one. Now I want to speak plainly about something that sits at the very heart of why people train for a smaller life, and that is the subject of philosophy. Not academic philosophy, not the kind that lives in universities and requires a specialized vocabulary, but personal personal philosophy, the set of ideas you actually hold about how life works, what you deserve, what's possible for someone like you, what role you play in the shaping of your own destiny. Your personal philosophy is the operating system of your life. Everything runs on it. Every decision passes through it. Every response to circumstance is filtered by it. And if the operating system is corrupted, if the core beliefs that govern your daily decisions are based on faulty premises, then no amount of tactical improvement will produce the results you're looking for. Let me give you an example of a corrupted operating system. Many people carry at the center of their personal philosophy the belief that the primary determinants of their life outcomes are external, that what happens to them is fundamentally a function of what the economy does, what the government does, what their employers do, what luck delivers or withholds, what their family background enabled or disabled. And on the surface, this sounds like it might be realistic. After all, those external forces are real. The economy is real. Circumstance is real. History is real. But here's the problem with placing the primary determinants of your life outside yourself. It simultaneously places the primary levers of change outside yourself. If external forces are the primary cause of your situation, then you must wait for external forces to change before your situation can change. And waiting for the external world to rearrange itself in your favor is the most reliable method I know for spending a lifetime in the training gym of diminishment. The philosophy that enables a larger life is not naive about external forces. It doesn't pretend that circumstances are irrelevant or that disadvantages don't exist, but it absolutely insists that your response to circumstances is yours, that between what happens and how you choose to engage with it, there is a space, and in that space lives everything. Your character lives there. Your growth lives there. The difference between the person who is shaped entirely by their circumstances and the person who uses circumstances as material to build something greater, that difference is found entirely in what happens in that space. Work on your philosophy before you work on anything else. Read the thinkers who have thought deeply about the nature of human agency and the conditions of a well-lived life. Examine the beliefs you hold about your own potential and ask yourself honestly where those beliefs came from and whether they deserve the authority you've given them. Challenge the assumptions that have been operating in the background of your decision-making, quietly constraining your choices, silently shrinking your world. Because many of the limitations you experience as facts about reality are actually just ideas you inherited early and never thought to question. I want to talk about health because this is another domain where the training for a smaller life happens so gradually, so incrementally, that people barely notice it happening until the accumulation becomes impossible to ignore. Your body is not merely a vehicle for your mind. Your body is the instrument through which everything you aspire to create will have to be created. Your energy, your focus, your emotional resilience, your cognitive clarity, your capacity to do the sustained work that meaningful achievement requires, all of these are profoundly, undeniably shaped by how you treat the physical instrument. And yet, watch how most people treat the body. Watch the progressive erosion of physical vitality that most people experience not as a sudden collapse, but as a slow, decades-long withdrawal of the energy and capacity they once took for granted. The body, which in younger years could be neglected and would recover, simply begins to deliver on the accumulated cost of that neglect. And the person who trained for a smaller life in the domain of health will find that the life they're living becomes physically smaller, not metaphorically, but literally. The range of what they can do, the energy available to pursue what matters, the sheer physicality of engagement with the world, all of it contracts. You don't have to be exceptional in this domain. You don't have to pursue athletic greatness, but you do have to be intentional. You have to decide that the body deserves the same quality of daily investment as any other significant asset in your life. Move deliberately, nourish deliberately, rest deliberately. These aren't luxuries. They are the maintenance of the instrument through which your entire life will be lived. I want to spend some time now on the subject of service because there is a particular irony about the training for a smaller life that I want to bring to your attention. The irony is this: the smaller the life a person is training for, the more self-focused that life becomes. And the more self-focused a life becomes, the smaller it feels from the inside. I've never met a deeply self-absorbed person who was genuinely fulfilled. I've never met someone whose primary occupation was their own comfort and security and approval who described their life as rich and meaningful and worth having lived, because human beings are not designed for self-containment. We are social creatures, relational creatures, creatures whose deepest sense of meaning and satisfaction arises not from what we accumulate, but from what we contribute. The larger life is always a life in service of something beyond itself. It might be a family, a community, a cause, an idea, a craft pursued at the highest level of devotion, but it is always pointed outward as well as inward. It always involves the question, what can I give, not just what can I get? And this is not altruism as I'm describing it. This is not the abandonment of self-interest. This is the deeper understanding that your greatest self-interest lies in becoming the kind of person who has something genuinely worth giving. When you develop your skills past the point of adequacy into the territory of genuine excellence, you have something to give. When you build your knowledge into wisdom, you have something to give. When you cultivate your character into the kind of reliability and integrity that people can depend on absolutely, you have something to give. And in the giving, in the genuine contribution to others' lives and to the world you inhabit, you discover the dimensions of your own capacity that a self-focused life would never have revealed. So let the question of service be part of your daily orientation. Not performed generosity, not the kind of giving that is really a form of self-promotion, but genuine, sincere, consistent attention to the question, how can I add value to the people around me today? How can I contribute something that makes the experience of others richer, easier, more meaningful? Because the person who wakes up asking that question is living in a fundamentally different relationship with the world than the person who wakes up asking only, what can I get from today? Let me talk about time, because the training for a smaller life has an intimate relationship with how we relate to the resource of time. Time is the great equalizer. Every person alive today, regardless of background, regardless of circumstance, regardless of the advantages or disadvantages they were born into, has been given the exact same 24 hours in which to work with. The person achieving remarkable things and the person achieving nothing are working with identical raw material in this one domain. And so the question of time management is really the question of life management. It is really the question of who you're choosing to be with the irreplaceable hours of the one life you've been given. Most people spend time as if they have an unlimited supply of it. They spend it carelessly, reactively, on the basis of what's immediately in front of them, rather than what ultimately matters to them. They drift through the day responding to whatever demands themselves, the urgent but not important, crowding out the important but not urgent. And at the end of the day, at the end of the week, at the end of the year, they feel the quiet, uncomfortable sense that the time is gone and they have little to show for it. Not because they weren't busy. They were tremendously busy, not because they weren't working hard, they worked very hard, but because the busyness was undirected, the hardness of the work was applied to other people's priorities rather than their own, and the hours accumulated into a life that was full of activity and empty of progress. Account for your time, not to torment yourself with productivity metrics, that's not what I mean, but to be honest about where the hours are actually going versus where you say your priorities are. Because here's a reliable test. Show me how you spend your time and I will show you what you actually value, not what you claim to value, not what you believe you value, but what your behavior demonstrates you value. And for most people, when they sit with that test honestly, there is a significant gap between their declared values and their demonstrated values, between what they say matters and how they actually spend the hours of their lives. Close that gap, not all at once. You don't need to redesign your entire existence in a single afternoon, but begin the process of alignment between what matters to you and where your time goes. Begin making the daily claim on your own hours before the world makes its claim, because the world will always have an agenda for your time if you don't have one first. The world will always find a way to fill your hours if you haven't filled them yourself with things that serve the life you're trying to build. I want to say something now about failure, about setback, about the inevitable difficulty that accompanies every genuine pursuit of something larger than your current situation. Because one of the most reliable ways people train for a smaller life is by treating failure as information about their ceiling, rather than feedback about their current approach. The moment you decide that a failure tells you something definitive about your capacity, the moment you allow a setback to become a conclusion rather than a lesson, you have handed over the most important tool in the development of a human being. You have surrendered the capacity to learn your way to a larger life. Every person who has ever built anything remarkable has a history of failure, not in spite of their achievement, as a precondition of it. The failures were the curriculum. They were the shaping forces. They were the places where the gap between current ability and required ability was made visible, and where, if the person had the philosophical foundation to respond with growth rather than retreat, they became more capable, more resilient, more equipped for the next challenge. What separates the person who grows from failure and the person who is diminished by it is not the nature of the failure. It is the question they ask in its aftermath. The diminishing question is, what does this say about me? The growing question is, what does this teach me? The diminishing question makes failure personal, permanent, and pervasive. The growing question makes it specific, temporary, and instructive. These are not merely different attitudes, they are different operating philosophies, and they produce dramatically different trajectories over time. Expect difficulty, expect setback, expect that there will be seasons of your pursuit when progress is invisible and the goal seems no closer than it did at the beginning. These seasons are not signs that you should stop, they are often signs that something important is being built below the surface, that the foundation is being laid, that the root system is going deeper before the branches go wider. Stay, do the work, trust the philosophy, and understand that the most important things you're building in those difficult, unrewarding seasons are not the external results. Those will come, but the internal qualities, persistence, patience, tenacity, the deep bone knowing that you can be tested by circumstance and not broken by it. There is something else I want to address, and this is a dimension of the training for a smaller life that people rarely examine because it lives in territory that feels too personal, too tender, too close to the bone to examine objectively, and that is the relationship between your past and your present. More specifically, the way your past is being used, because the past can be used two ways. It can be used as a foundation, as context, as a collection of experiences, both painful and joyful, that have contributed to who you are and that you carry forward as wisdom. Or it can be used as a cage. And I have watched too many people spend the majority of their adult lives sitting inside a cage built from old experiences, old wounds, old failures, old messages they received from people who were themselves living small and couldn't imagine anything different for the people around them. Somebody told you early on that you weren't particularly gifted. Maybe a teacher. Maybe a parent. Maybe a peer whose opinion carried more weight in that season than it deserved to carry. And you took that message and filed it in a place that felt permanent. You gave it authority. You allowed it to become one of the organizing principles of your self-concept. And from that point forward, without even being conscious of it, you began operating as though that verdict had been handed down by a court that knew your full potential and had weighed it carefully and found it wanting. But think about the absurdity of that. Think about the absurdity of allowing a comment made by a limited person in a single moment of your development to serve as the definitive statement about the breadth and depth of your capacity for the rest of your life. The person who told you that you weren't enough was themselves not seeing clearly. They were looking at a snapshot of you at a moment in time and drawing conclusions that extended far beyond what any snapshot could justify. They were, in all likelihood, working from the constraints of their own limited philosophy, their own unexplored assumptions about what people are and aren't capable of, and you gave them a permanent seat at the table of your self-understanding. Revoke that seat, not with bitterness. Bitterness is a poison that harms only the one who carries it. Not with anger toward those who gave you limiting messages. Most of them didn't know what they were doing. Most of them were well-intentioned if short-sighted. But with clarity, with the firm, reasoned recognition that whoever decided what you were capable of decades ago was not equipped with the evidence to make that determination. That evidence is still being gathered. That story is still being written. And the pen is in your hand. Because here's the truth about human potential. The genuine, observed, documented truth. It is not fixed. It is not a quantity assigned at birth and gradually depleted by the years. It is alive. It is responsive. It grows in proportion to the demands made of it. The person who asks more of themselves consistently, persistently, with the philosophical backbone to keep asking even when the answer is slow in coming, that person discovers reserves of ability they never knew existed until they were summoned by the challenge of something genuinely difficult. The oak doesn't know it's capable of becoming an oak when it's a small seed in the ground, but put it in the right conditions. Give it soil and water and sunlight and the opposition of wind and gravity that forces it to develop structural strength, and it becomes exactly what it was always capable of becoming. You are not different from that principle. You don't know the full extent of what you're capable of. Nobody does until they begin the genuine, sustained attempt to find out. And the sad truth is that most people never make that attempt. They die with the seed intact, never having given it the conditions it needed to discover its own nature. Now, I want to address the matter of excuses because no honest conversation about the training for a smaller life can avoid it. Excuses are not nothing. They are something very specific. They are the stories we construct to maintain the gap between our declared values and our demonstrated behavior without experiencing the full discomfort of that gap. They are the narrative mechanism by which we preserve our self-image as someone who would achieve more, who would try harder, who would live bigger, if only the circumstances were different, and we have become extraordinarily sophisticated in their construction. The excuses have evolved. They used to be simple. I don't have enough money. I don't have enough time. I don't have the right connections. These are still present, still active, still persuasive to the people who rely on them. But we've added more nuanced, more psychologically sophisticated versions. I haven't healed enough yet to pursue what I want. I need to work on myself before I can give to others. I'm waiting to be more aligned. I need to process my past before I can build my future. And while some of these contain genuine wisdom, the inner work is real, the importance of understanding yourself is real, they have also become, for some people, indefinitely extended permission slips for delay, a moving target of readiness that conveniently recedes just ahead of the moment when they'd have to actually commit. Here is what I know about readiness. You are never going to feel completely ready for the thing that matters, not because you're inadequate, because readiness is not a state that precedes significant action. It is a state that develops through significant action. You don't get ready and then begin. You begin, and in the beginning, readiness accumulates. The confidence that most people are waiting to feel before they start is actually only available on the other side of starting. Which means if you wait for it, you are waiting for something that can only be earned by doing the very thing the absence of it is preventing you from doing. Begin imperfectly. Begin without all the tools. Begin with the resources you have and the conditions that exist, with the knowledge and skill and confidence you currently possess, because they will grow the moment you put them to work. The alternative, waiting until everything is in place, until you feel truly ready, until the moment seems ideal, that alternative is indistinguishable from never beginning. And never beginning is the most total possible expression of training for a smaller life. I also want to speak about money, because money intersects with this conversation in ways that matter practically. Not because money is the measure of a well-lived life. It absolutely is not. But because financial constraint is one of the most powerful and commonly cited reasons people give for the limitations of their circumstances, and because the relationship most people have with their finances is itself a clear expression of whether they're training for a larger life or a smaller one. Most people relate to money reactively. They earn it and spend it and then wonder where it went. They have no deliberate architecture around how money moves through their life, no intentional structure that reflects their actual values and actual priorities. And then inevitably, money becomes a source of anxiety, of constraint, of the feeling that important things are impossible because the resources simply aren't there. And they're right, the resources aren't there. But often the reason they're not there is not income. The reason in most cases is the absence of a philosophy around money that serves the building of a larger life. Spend less than you earn. This is not a novel idea. This has been the foundational principle of financial health since the first human beings began trading. Spend less than you earn and invest the difference in things that grow. In your education, in your health, in opportunities that have the potential to expand your income and your options, in actual financial instruments that compound quietly over time into genuine security and eventually into genuine freedom. The mathematics of this are not complicated. The discipline required is not exotic, but most people never do it. Not because they can't, but because the training for a smaller life includes a philosophy around money that prioritizes immediate gratification over long-term capacity, that trades tomorrow's freedom for today's comfort, that consumes the seed corn rather than planting it. Your relationship with money is a relationship with your future. How you handle what you have right now is practicing and proving how you would handle more. People who say they would live differently if only they had more money are almost universally mistaken, because the habits and philosophy they carry would simply reproduce at a higher scale. More income in the hands of someone with a small life financial philosophy doesn't produce freedom. It produces larger versions of the same constraints. The transformation has to happen at the level of the philosophy, the habits, the daily decisions around this particular resource, and it has to happen now with what you have, not later with what you hope to have. Let me speak about the matter of craft, because this is something I feel deeply about and believe is underemphasized in conversations about human potential. Whatever it is you do, whatever work you perform, whatever skill you exercise, whatever contribution you're positioned to make, there is a level of excellence available to you in that domain that you have not yet reached. And the pursuit of that excellence, the genuine, humble, relentless pursuit of becoming truly extraordinary at what you do, is one of the most powerful antidotes to the training for a smaller life that I know of. Mediocrity in your craft is its own form of smallness, not because the work is humble. No legitimate work is beneath excellence, but because showing up to what you do with less than your best, accepting a standard of good enough, doing just enough to fulfill the obligation without doing enough to genuinely honor the work. That is a practice of diminishment. It trains you to accept less from yourself. And a person who accepts less from themselves in their work will accept less from themselves in everything else. Show up to whatever you do as if the work itself deserves your best, not as a performance for an audience, not to be seen working hard or to earn someone else's approval, but as an expression of who you are, because how you do anything is practice for how you do everything. The person who applies genuine excellence to a modest task is building the habit of excellence that will serve them in every subsequent, more significant task. The person who cuts corners in the small moments is rehearsing corner cutting for the moments that matter. Character is not summoned on demand. It is demonstrated by who you are in the ordinary moments when the stakes seem low and nobody is paying particular attention. Be a student of your craft. Find the people who do what you do at the highest level and study them, not to copy them, to understand the principles underlying their excellence. Ask the questions that most people in your field aren't asking. Read beyond the boundaries of your immediate domain and import ideas from elsewhere that might transform what you do. Be curious. Be humble in the face of how much there is to learn. Because the moment you decide you've learned enough, the moment you stop being a committed student, you've begun the decline. You've started the slow erosion of capability that over time leaves you further and further behind the person you were capable of becoming. There is a concept I want to name directly, and that is the concept of the compound effect in human development. Just as money compounds when properly invested, just as the interest earns interest, the gain multiplies the principal, and over time the growth becomes extraordinary relative to the original investment. So does personal development compound. The knowledge you acquire today makes tomorrow's learning faster and deeper. The discipline you build today makes next year's discipline easier to maintain. The character you develop through handling this year's challenges makes next year's challenges less likely to break you. It compounds. It builds on itself. It creates an accelerating trajectory that, from the outside, looks like sudden success, but is actually the delayed, compounding reward of years of consistent investment in becoming. The training for a smaller life has its own compound effect, working in the opposite direction. The habits of avoidance, of postponement, of intellectual laziness, of the half-commitment to goals, these also compound. The diminishment also builds on itself. The more comfortable you become with settling, the more natural settling feels. The more familiar the contracted life becomes, the more threatening the expanded life seems. The smaller you allow yourself to become, the more courage it would take to expand, and the less courage is available because courage is itself a muscle that either grows through use or atrophies through disuse. Both directions are self-reinforcing. Both are moving. The question is simply, which direction? Start the compound growth immediately, today, with one decision that points in the direction of your potential rather than your comfort. With one act of discipline that overrides the preference for ease. With 1 hour invested in your development rather than your distraction. And tomorrow do the same thing, and the day after. Not because any single day will produce visible transformation, it won't. But because you are establishing a direction, and direction maintained consistently over time is everything. Trajectory matters more than position. Where you're pointed matters more than where you are. And the person who is pointed toward growth and moving forward, however slowly, is in a fundamentally different relationship with the future than the person standing still. I want to address one final dimension before we arrive at the conclusion, and that is the matter of your identity, the story you tell about who you are. Because of all the forces that shape a human life, few are as powerful or as under-examined as self-identity. What you believe yourself to be at the deepest, most fundamental level is what you will consistently act to confirm. Not because the belief is accurate, it may not be, but because the mind is extraordinarily efficient at finding evidence for what it has already decided is true and at creating behavior that is consistent with the identity it holds. If you have decided at some level below conscious articulation that you are the kind of person who doesn't quite make it, who gets close but falls short, who has good ideas but poor execution, who starts well but doesn't finish, then your behavior will consistently cooperate with that narrative. Not out of self-sabotage in any dramatic sense, but simply because the mind works to maintain coherence between its self-concept and its actions. Inconsistency is uncomfortable. The mind resolves that discomfort by pulling the behavior back in line with the belief. So if the belief is small, the behavior follows it back down. This is why working on identity is not vanity or self-delusion. It is the most practical thing you can do. When you deliberately, intentionally, consistently begin to identify as a person who does the work, who follows through, who chooses growth, who builds things that matter, your behavior will begin to reorganize around that identity. Not perfectly and not immediately, but the direction of pull changes, the default changes. The thing that feels natural begins to shift. And over time, through the accumulation of actions that confirm the new identity and the steady replacement of actions that confirm the old one, you become the person you've decided to be. This is not wishful thinking. This is how character is built. This is how it has always been built. Every person of genuine substance you have ever admired, every person whose character and achievement warranted your respect, constructed that character and that achievement through exactly this process, the repeated decision to act in accordance with the identity they were committed to inhabiting, even before the evidence fully supported it, even before the world reflected it back to them, even when the old identity was pulling hard in the opposite direction. Decide now who you are becoming, not who you have been. That chapter is written, and its lessons are the inheritance that travels with you forward. But who you are in the process of becoming, make that decision explicitly, give it language, carry it consciously, and then let every subsequent decision pass through the filter of that identity. Not, what do I feel like doing right now, but what would the person I'm committed to becoming do right now? That single shift in the framing of daily decisions has the power to transform a life over time from one that is constantly negotiating with smallness to one that is steadily expanding toward its fullest possible expression. Let me bring this toward its close by speaking about legacy, because ultimately, this is what the conversation is really about. Not strategies and tactics, not morning routines and reading lists, not even discipline and philosophy in the abstract, but the life you will have lived when you come to the end of it.